Welcome, everyone. All right. Well, I'm sure folks are going to be trickling in, coming in from the break. So I will first introduce myself, and then we will kind of get into it, and I'll provide kind of an overview of what the plan is for today's panel discussion. So hi, everyone. My name is Sada Naegelin. I am an energy coach and manager and diversity, equity, and inclusion lead at Stillwater Energy based in Portland, Oregon. Really excited to be at BECC this year and to be the moderator for this discussion today. So today we're going to be talking about change management at the heart of energy efficiency and diversity, equity, and inclusion. My work at Stillwater Energy primarily focuses on strategic energy management. And if you're not familiar with strategic energy management, or SEM, it is a holistic approach to energy management that looks at energy efficiency both from the technical and organizational perspectives. And one of the things I love so much about SEM, or strategic energy management, is that it really centers people. It centers people who occupy our commercial and industrial spaces to be part of the solution to develop persistent energy savings over the long term. And integral to that energy management and creating that persistent savings over the long term is change management. And change management is so important because, again, it centers people. It is the people side of change. And change management really acknowledges that any change starts at the individual level. And I am admittedly early in my diversity, equity, and inclusion career, but immediately what drew me to doing the work of DEI and bringing diversity, equity, and inclusion lenses to any system is the change management piece, is the piece about people, right? Ultimately, DEI is about people within a system and how we can change that system to better serve the needs of the people that are in it and the people that we are serving. So for many organizations, the catalyst for DEI work began last year with the murder of George Floyd and others, Breonna Taylor, and the subsequent racial justice protests that happened around the world. However, many organizations have been looking at energy equity in the energy efficiency space and really working to address racial and social inequities in the energy sector. So while that work has been going on for many years, it has really been elevated. The conversation has been highlighted. So first, I want to acknowledge, before we get into our discussion today, that when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and specifically energy equity, what we're really talking about is addressing systemic racism. And any change, any behavior change, starts with awareness. So we first need to recognize and be aware of the systemic racism that exists within the institutions and organizations that we live and work in. And know that historically, these systems have been designed to not serve everyone and to not serve everyone equally. So first we acknowledge that, but then we also need to know that we each play a role in dismantling racism and addressing discrimination and inequities that permeate the organizations and industries in which we work. So this DEI conversation today, of course, is not a one-off conversation. It's part of a much larger and ongoing conversation, nor is the work of DEI simply checking boxes, but rather it's an intentional and long-term commitment that we make to do the work and change our systems to be more equitable, inclusive, and diverse. So how do we leverage change management to center DEI in energy efficiency and in the energy sector? To discuss this topic today, I'm thrilled to be joined by a panel of accomplished women who are each inspiring in their own right in the work that they've done in the energy space, in the energy efficiency space. So I'll introduce them briefly and then they'll have a chance to introduce themselves. Pamela Fan serves as the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance Director of Membership and Diversity Integration. SEIA, their mission is to drive market transformation in the Southeast energy efficiency sector while ensuring energy efficiency is equitable for all communities that they serve. Pam has a degree in marketing, a certification in human resource management, and is a certified cultural diversity professional and trainer. She has served on a diversity board for more than 7 years with the Coca-Cola Company and served on the advisory board of Georgia Tech Women's Entrepreneurship Program, supporting women entrepreneurs in the African diaspora. We are also joined by Caryn Appler, who is an outreach manager for the Energy Trust of Oregon, a nonprofit that supports customers of investor-owned utilities with resources, technical support, and incentives to offset the cost of energy savings. Caryn works to establish and grow relationships with local leadership, organizations, businesses, customers, and contractors across Eastern Oregon to learn about the needs that are unique to rural, Black, Indigenous, people of color, low-income customers, and expand the benefits provided by the Energy Trust of Oregon programs. And Giselle Hancock is joining us. She is Director of Company Network at Sarah's. As a strategic advisor and external relationship lead, she provides guidance to Sarah's company network. Prior, Giselle managed energy efficiency, electric power, and transportation programs at the Northeastern Energy Efficiency Partnership, or NEEP. She also served as Director of Energy, Technology, and Management at the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. So you can see our panelists bring a wealth of information, experience, and expertise to bear on this conversation today. And before we hear from them, quickly wanted to just kind of have a chance for folks to chime in the chat to share your perspective. And the question I have for you all is, do you believe individuals have a role to play in making the energy sector more diverse, equitable, and inclusive? So if you would just drop your answer in the chat there. Want to encourage everyone to use the chat throughout our time today. This really will be a discussion and conversation. And so we invite you to chime in with your comments and questions in the chat and use that tool. So just to reiterate, people are at the center of change. So how do we engage them in inclusive and equitable ways to drive change within energy efficiency in the energy sector? I'm looking forward to a rich conversation today and how we can leverage change management to center DEI in our energy efficiency work. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to our panelists to introduce themselves. And we will start with Giselle.
Oh, thanks, Sada. As Sada mentioned before, I'm a director within the company network at Ceres, and a lot of what I do day to day is to work with Fortune 500 companies to move forward their ESG agenda. That's environmental, social, and governance agenda, and to just take a deep dive, in issues that need addressing, on basically looking at their triple bottom line. Before joining Ceres, I worked with not-for-profit organizations and government. I worked with corporate organizations. I also worked with utilities on commercial and industrial programs and residential programs. Similar to Sada, I worked on strategic energy management for quite a while. I worked on pay-for-performance programs, grid interactive, efficient building programs, and demand response programs. And I see that you have here, Sada, you wanted us to answer the question, why are we committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the work that we do? And for me, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a commitment of mine, I think mostly because of my deep sense of humanity. And because I feel that the underserved and the underprivileged need to be seen and heard and considered, and also because I feel like everyone should be given the opportunity to contribute to moving the needle on climate change. Currently, many underserved communities are not involved in decisions that directly impact them. And I feel like representatives from these communities need to have seats at the table when decisions are being made about them. So the energy efficiency program world, one of the big questions is, is there equitable access to energy efficiency solutions, and are services being delivered that lead to fair and equitable outcomes? From my experience, even taking the first step of reaching out to underserved and underrepresented communities to educate them is very often onerous. And then convincing these communities that the deployment of energy efficiency solutions can benefit them, is another task within itself, because many of these communities comprise individuals who don't even have the upfront costs, to participate in these programs. But I do believe, with better strategic planning and putting the right incentives in place, that everyone would get a chance to do right by saving energy and ultimately doing their part to fight against climate change. So that's a little bit about me. And again, thank you, Sada, for inviting me to be part of this panel and to speak on this very important topic today.
Thank you, Giselle. Happy to have you. Next, let's hear from Caryn Appler.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see you all, and I appreciate the opportunity to present on this panel. As Sada mentioned, I'm an outreach manager for the Energy Trust of Oregon. We are actually a nonprofit that works with the investor-owned utilities, Pacific Power, Cascade Natural Gas, Avista, Northwest Natural, and Portland General Electric. My role serves directly communities throughout Eastern Oregon in an 8-county area that is actually considered rural and frontier by USDA guidelines. And I guess what I should share with that is I have one county, Wallowa County, which is actually 3,152 square miles, but it only has 7,000 residents. And their livelihoods are based on tourism, agriculture, and natural resources. Whereas another county in my service region, Malheur County, is very high in number of households getting by on less than $10,000 a year, and is actually one of the highest concentrations in the state of residents who speak a language other than English in their home. So the service region is extremely diverse, even though it's still painted with a rural and frontier brush. The role I have, I like to say it, I almost say double agent, but I'm out there and I'm making sure that our customers know the resources and technical support that we have to offer. But at the same time, I'm working to establish relationships with local leaders, organizations, businesses, contractors, along with our everyday customers to learn about their unique needs. When I moved to Pendleton, Oregon, where I live today in 2006, it was a real eye-opener for me. Where I moved from in Maryland was considered a rural part of the state. And I really, as you might imagine, my opinion on what rural is has changed quite a bit. My first job in this community was with Intermountain Education Service District, and they support 7 counties in Eastern Oregon, mostly the same service region that I continue to support today. And for those of you who aren't familiar with ESDs, they're a state-funded network that provides schools with what they call resolution services. So they're essential services like special education, nursing, health, and safety. And they're a model that actually works really well in rural communities. As you might imagine, finding a speech language pathologist to support a school district that only has 102 students in a town with a population of less than 1,500 can be really challenging. But one thing that particularly emerged, which created my initial intersection with energy and the disparities and challenges, is that a lot of our school districts were facing issues with facilities. They didn't have the enrollment numbers or the business tax base to make these investments. And they had a wealth of deferred maintenance that impacted student learning, health, and safety. Really important stuff, our next generation. So I actually worked on project teams to help districts and their communities first identify the needs and help them communicate to get feedback from their voting community. Admittedly, most of the time it was the goal of helping them obtain a yes for bond measure, but the other side of that was these things needed to be homegrown. These things were not things that we could tell them to do. They needed to be born and bought in by from the community. And so, you know, if we were successful on the yes vote, I then worked with the district to assist them with their procurements for design and construction. And it was this time I had my first connection with energy efficiency programs, mostly, you know, in making sure that the taxpayer dollars got stretched the furthest and that these investments were being smart. The mantra was always every dollar saved was one that went back in the classroom. And ultimately, I ended up leaving the ESD and working for a Native-owned construction project management firm, essentially working in the same capacity. However, specifically in regard to procurements of contractors and supply, we were also able to include socioeconomic requirements for local impact economic spend, as well as minority and women-owned business participation. So I'll get into a little bit more about when I talk about engagement, but it was really how I understood that connection between energy and community and how relationships were really important, making sure that the community was aligned with what was going on. So I'll leave it here and I'll pass it back to you, Sada, and look forward to sharing with you more later.
Great, thank you, Caryn. And now Pamela Fan.
Thank you, Sada, and thank you for having us here today to speak on this important topic and these issues. So I am Pamela Fan. I am the Director of Membership and Diversity Integration for Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance. And as mentioned earlier, we are one of 6 regional energy efficiency offices, and we support the Southeast states from Virginia through Florida. It's 11 states that are within our portfolio, up from Louisiana to Kentucky and Tennessee and Arkansas. So we have a pretty large fold there of states that we actually support. A little background about myself. So I've been with SIA almost, about 3.5 years now. And I previously worked for the Coca-Cola Company for 22 years, serving in public affairs and communications in my last role there. And also I served on a diversity board there for 7 years. So when I came into the energy industry, about my 3rd conference in, I looked around and I said, where are all the people that look like me? It was a conference of about 700 participants, y'all. I was one of 2 Black women. Maybe there were only about 10 to 15 women, and the rest were male, majority white male. And, that was about the 3rd conference. And it had, the first 2 conferences, I kind of figured it was a fluke. Surely there are Black people here in energy, right? I didn't see it. The representation wasn't there. And so I kind of, having the background in serving on diversity boards and having the background of being a minority and the experience of that was something that I kind of set out to change for, that I felt like I could add value to and set out to change. So there were a list of things that I did subsequently, but probably one of the most important things was getting certified as a diversity professional and trainer and taking our own organization through a cultural competency framework, ensuring that we as an organization, although I felt very, very confident in the fact that we were culturally aware, and we were culturally competent, just ensuring that we were doing all of the things necessary within our own organization to ensure cultural competency. So taking us through that framework, which we're still on that journey today, but this was in 2018 when we started. This was well before George Floyd. This was well before Breonna Taylor. This was well before Ahmaud Arbery, because if you notice it, how can you just sit and not do anything? Why do you wait for something to happen to step up, right? So when those incidents happened and the social unrest happened, we were well primed and in position to be able to kind of help our members lead their efforts. And so then I began consulting with our members as well in helping them to understand what their own cultural competency makeup was. And I will say that that's kind of twofold. So we're talking about internally, with your employees, and we're also talking about externally within the systems and the way that you work. And those are the things that are really important to me and why I'm committed to doing this work, because it is creating systemic change that's going to be everlasting. It's not the let us put out a statement of how we're going to do better or how we feel about it, but it's that we've actually put forth measures. We're actually looking at diversity within this industry now. Our eyes are wide open, and now we're talking about it. So, you know, when I think about the commitment of this work, I think about the people in the Southeast market that we support. They have the Southeast market. Well, yes, we have some of the lowest rates. We have some of the highest utility bills in the US, but we also have some of the most lowest economic peoples in the US. So energy burden is real here. It's very real, and it's a hard fact, and it's no surprise that those who are experiencing energy burden are also, many of those are ones who are in redlined communities. There's a correlation there, people. And so we have to think about, how do we undo those systems? How do we undo those inequities, and how do we make it right? With this new, the new administration and all the initiatives that are coming back from the Build Back America plan, we cannot afford to leave these communities behind. We cannot afford to leave minority peoples behind in this transition. It has to happen. So we really need to think collectively and smartly about how we go about doing this work. But look forward to speaking more about it. Thank you, Sada.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. Absolutely. Well, I think something that you all touched on are the underserved and underrepresented communities across the regions that you serve. And one thing that is of interest to me is, so my background is in community engagement and working primarily with the Latinx community. But as I came into this work and energy efficiency in the commercial and industrial space, I've been struck by the lack of conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion within commercial and industrial energy efficiency. So often the conversation focuses on residential, and rightfully so. There are great inequities there, but there are also a great diversity of people that work within commercial and industrial spaces that individually have an impact. Their behavior has an impact on energy use in the places that they work. So I kind of want to steer us in that direction for a moment, just to talk about the challenges and the opportunities of applying DEI in the commercial and industrial space. And I think first we'll start with Giselle. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Thanks, Sada. And, first of all, I think that organizations need to be very, very clear, on what DEI means to them, and to set some boundaries around how far and how deep they would like to go as far as being accountable to their stakeholders, and as far as asking for accountability from their stakeholders. I think for every company, this will definitely be different. Keeping in mind that the inclusion of DEI into programs is something that, as you mentioned before, Sada, it's relatively novel for most utilities and program administrators. I feel like starting by taking intentional baby steps, is not a bad idea. But definitely setting short-term and long-term goals is something that should be done, in addition to creating roadmaps and how, to get to the goals, the short-term and the long-term goals that are set. As far as your challenges are concerned, for the CNI sector, one of the challenges is addressing diversity when it comes to the customer pool. As an organization in and of itself does not have a single racial, cultural, or ethnic, identification. The utility or program administrator, is often meeting with one or two persons within an organization. So there's not as much transparency into who you are serving. So for the customer facing part of it, I don't even know if diversity from that angle, is considered. But there's a lot of opportunity. There is opportunity to offer equitable access, and delivery services that lead to equitable outcomes. When thinking about diversity and inclusion in terms of service delivery, I think that there is a lot of opportunity out there for the utilities to consider hiring diversity consultants, partnering with diverse suppliers and making a conscious effort to support diversity within the workforce and the communities that they serve. I think also there's a lot of opportunity in taking time to do research and to get to understand the customer landscape better and getting to understand individual customers better, and sitting with customers to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion. That might be a utility's only opportunity, to get to understand and also learn about that customer's position on DEI and how best they can work with that customer, on DEI related programs and issues, going forward. So yeah, so that is my 2 cents on that, Sada.
Thank you. Pam, I saw a lot of nodding from you. I'm curious.
Yeah, no, Giselle hit a lot of great points on the head. What I implore organizations to do, aside from just like getting a diversity consultant, which is, really paramount if you don't know what you're doing, right? You can make a statement, but then you have to back it up. You gotta, and then when you do back that up, you gotta make sure your own house is in order. You can say, oh, we're gonna do this and we're gonna do that. But then if your employees are unhappy, if it's not a great place to work, if it's not a culturally safe place to work, meaning that your employees cannot bring them whole selves to work, then how do you expect to execute on those statements? And how do you expect for consumers and your consumer base to believe you? Consumers aren't stupid now. They know that there are blanketed statements out there and they don't see people doing the work, especially when it comes, utilities have been very good at responding to this that I've found anyway, at least many of the ones in our region who know that these consumers, they're watching what you're doing. They're watching the programs. They're seeing if you're engaging with communities and those who work within communities to get this work done. So, I think that this is an opportunity for all of them all organizations really to step up. And I know that, there are many that also put, percentages behind diversity spend and working with minority businesses. And that's just another part of that engagement process when you're looking at programming. There are so many wonderful minority organizations out there doing this work. But what I hear from those minority companies and minority businesses is that they're not getting the tier 1 contracts. They're being brought in on the diversity spend. Can we get past that, y'all? Can we get past that? Can we not say that a minority-owned business will do just as great work as one that's not and give them the business? You know what I mean? So that's how you make things equitable. You don't give just the diversity spend to the diversity businesses. You bring them in as tier 1s. You show your confidence in the diverse organization. So there's so much work to be done around that as well. So there's, again, it's more than consumers, but it's also in how we support diverse businesses within this industry as well.
Absolutely, Pam. I'm so glad that you highlighted that. That's just another form of tokenism, right? It's just a different flavor. Yeah, absolutely. Caryn, I want to give you a chance to chime in because I know you've done a lot of work with different commercial and industrial businesses in Eastern Oregon, and there are unique challenges in every region, I think, to the opportunities and that we have in bringing this lens to our work.
Thanks, Sada. Well, one thing that just popped into my head that I actually didn't have in my notes, but it was part of our conversation when these wonderful women and we all convened to talk about this opportunity, was just to say how much this work is interconnected with everything else. There is not one conversation to be had with one organization or one group. And when we talk about things like energy, we're really talking about the whole run between making someone's home energy efficient on up to, what are they doing at their place of work in a manufacturing plant. And so To me, engagement is all about relationships, and cultivating relationships is not an easy thing. It's actually not for everybody, and Energy Trust, the organization I work with, has put a high value on that development. It's actually why the outreach position I currently hold was created about 15 years ago. But, to speak to the other things, you really should begin these conversations by knowing why you're seeking to establish the relationship in the first place. This is where I think organizations can really stub their toe pretty hard, because if they're just doing it to meet some goal, that's wrong. If you're meeting with a community-based organization to have them act as an extension of your program, that's not the right way to go about it. These types of conversations should be mutually beneficial and reinforcing. And, particularly again, familiar mostly with my service region, but a lot of the community leaders and the people that are really doing good work, they wear so many hats. So being very respectful to them, clear about the intent of what you're talking to them about from the start, and being, honoring their time, compensating them from their time, and also not trying to bring solutions to problems that you don't understand yet. It's a very dynamic process. You need to allow for changes over time. You need to take time to understand each other's values, repeat engagements, again, not a one and done type of thing. And also establish, trust, and demonstrating respect is not, a one visit proposition. It takes years. So, those aren't concepts that are new or original, but they are really important to be centered on. I also wanted to acknowledge that Energy Trust, we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion operations plan that actually started in 2018, essentially to help us better understand where our gaps exist so we can improve what we have to offer BIPOC community members, low-income community members, and rural community members who have been underserved by our programs in the past. And, to that end, it's actually going under its first revision right now. And, we've made a lot of different strategies to help that plan move along, including the hiring of a DEI lead that is sort of both our internal and external guiding light. We also have a diversity advisory committee, as well as some community-based liaisons that cut across both commercial and industrial markets. And then we also have a community partner-funded pathway, which is increased incentives that we leverage through community-based organizations who want to work with us. So that's essentially, how we're trying to do it. It's not perfect. We're going under our revisions, and we're trying to take in as much input as we can, but it is an evolution, and you really need to be centered, and it's not about you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Caryn. Well, quickly, I just want to invite audience members, please chime in, ask questions. If there's anything in particular that you want to dig deeper on, go ahead and put that in the chat. So an invitation to the audience for those questions right now. I'm going to actually continue on that thread, Caryn, of engagement, because you and I had a great opportunity to work together, specifically on community engagement in Eastern Oregon, and would love to hear more about how Energy Trust and how you think about stakeholder engagement to inform more equitable and inclusive programs, especially your energy efficiency programs. Yeah.
With our process, Sada, the one that we did, one of our, oversight of Energy Trust is we actually report to the Oregon Public Utility Commission. They also have some DEI goals that began in 2019. And one of those goals was to conduct some rural engagement strategies on a larger scale, in which that's where we work with Stillwater. And as you know, when we started to meet, one of my first things was thinking to myself, I know this community, but do I know this community? So I started that whole approach on research, and then talking to people that I did know and saying, who else should I be talking to? Who else is an important person to be at this table? Because I think a lot of times we think of the elected leadership, our mayors and their city council members, but we also don't think about those unofficial folks, that they know people and they know who to bring to the table. and they're trusted in the community, and, you know, getting, you know, establishing relationships with them and gaining their trust is very important. And it's also doing all those things, like I said, not just calling them one time, but, you know, not only providing them information and building the relationship over time, but also doing what you say you're going to do. And because that's also, I think, a place where we really stub our toe, again, checking the box and not. So pulling together that opportunity, we knew in this particular community, there were going to be community members who English is not their first language. Even if they speak English, they might not be able to read English or Spanish. So we actually worked with the local high school to deploy some student leaders throughout the community to engage with community members, to have a survey prior to meeting, again, trying to center ourselves on the topics that were most important to them. Because most times, you know, you say, well, what are your biggest concerns about energy? Well, energy is not their biggest concern. Energy is not even on the map. So centering it again on those conversations, you know, talking about things like energy burden and health, you know, whether or not somebody's economic situation is making it so they can't get a better job. They can't drive further to get a better job, so that they would qualify for. So these are just the things you want to understand, and then designing the agenda around those types of topics, and then bringing the appropriate resources to engage. And we're actually having a conversation very similar right now with our industrial team. We're going to be holding some roundtables in those same ways with community leaders in the industrial space, trying to bring some of the same conversations forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think highlighting the informal leaders is really important, especially when we're dealing with underserved communities, right? Oftentimes, it's not going to be the elected officials that are the trusted leaders within a community. And that's so important, right? Whenever we're talking about any kind of change management, again, right? Finding the trustworthy voice to deliver the message, and leveraging those voices and engaging them authentically and building those relationships is key. Go ahead, Caryn.
The only one thing I was also going to add is something that I learned very recently in another community engagement, was just our programs can look like quasi-government regulatory type things, right? So folks are a little fearful of letting us in the door, which also just reinforces that relationship piece from a local individual. And I think that's also really important to remember.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, you know, empathy is key here, right? When we're thinking about all of these issues of equity and inclusion, is being able to put ourselves in other people's shoes and think from their perspective a little bit more. Giselle or Pam, anything to add? There's a question from the audience I want to share next, but wanted to give you an opportunity to chime in. Okay. Well, then Reuven here asks, what do you think about the use of behavior programs to reduce energy consumption among low-income communities? And I'll just kind of put that to the group. Maybe Giselle or Caryn have thoughts about that.
So I don't know, like, I'll let you go.
Go ahead.
I'll go. When I
Yeah.
think about that, I'm thinking behavior programs, right? And when you're talking about low income, we're not even talking about low to moderate income. I put myself in one of those categories, like not so many years ago. I would have probably been a low income community person. And thinking about the patterns of day-to-day living, I don't feel like I was wasting energy. And I can tell you probably a majority of the households who have energy burden, who have those high electric bills, they're probably shutting off lights. You know, we have the thing where your mom always tells you, go cut off every light when you leave the room. You know, there are things that they're doing that will, that they think is saving energy. But what you're finding in many of these situations, it's the housing stock. It's the fact that they live in unhealthy homes, and they live in homes that aren't efficient. They live in homes that are drafty. They live in homes that have, weatherization issues. And a lot of times those are the creators of the energy inefficiencies. It's not necessarily just the behaviors, and so I can tell you from my own personal experience that it wasn't the behaviors. And while yes, we can go and do behavioral programming, we've got electric meters now. We've got meters that can tell when it's, in a particular house, when they're utilizing the most, probably when they come home from school early in the morning, getting ready for school and work, or coming home after work and school, but if you're just living your daily life and you don't consider that's not a behavioral type of problem. So that's just my own thought on it, having been that low income person at one point and saying, cut those lights off, close my refrigerator door. And maybe there's education around it because, we didn't really, I think, well, way back then, it wasn't about the LED lights, but more education about, utilizing LED lights or other ways to be able to do it. But in all honesty, it was likely just the house. And I needed a weatherization team to come in and tell me what the problems were and what needs to be fixed and help me solve that problem. So that's my thought.
But I would add, in terms of the bigger organizations and the CNI organizations, that's probably where behavioral changes come in, because at that point, you really want to change the fabric of the organization. You really want to change how people are thinking and how they're acting based on the way that they think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where there's interesting opportunities on the commercial and industrial side around engaging underrepresented groups, right? So one thing that we've talked about with some of our school district customers that we work with in strategic energy management is engaging their custodial staff, because custodial teams are there at night. So they see what lights get left on. They see what personal appliances are in, classrooms. So we've actually talked about, okay, so then what does your custodial staff need? Is English their first language? Is English their preferred language? If we want to engage them, how do we engage them in a meaningful way? Do they need information about energy use and their energy use behaviors that's in a different language? That's when we can kind of start to, I think, address some of those behavioral needs and culturally tailoring our programs to the different people that occupy these spaces. Excellent. Well, let's see here. I'm just jumping into the chat. I'm going to first turn to Giselle, and then I'll get to the chat in a moment. So know that I see your comments coming through. But Giselle, I wanted to, touch more on kind of the organizationally what you've seen work, right? This kind of speaks to the change management piece of all this. So organizationally, what needs to happen for us to, engage more diverse audiences in equitable and inclusive ways with programs and bringing those programs in the CNI space?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, it's along the lines of ensuring that this DEI aspect of program development is an item on the strategic planning agenda every year. Having buy-in from the top is important, and then ensuring that everyone is on the same page when it comes to making this, a paramount focus. Organizations also need to ensure that there is someone within the organization who is responsible for ensuring that DEI would be included in the development of these programs, and who will be held accountable, for its inclusion. Then have a performance system in place to measure and to assess the extent to which DEI has been included in the programs. And along the way, do things like take notes of the challenges, the obstacles, the lessons learned, when attempting to include DEI into these programs. And then finally, make improvements, based on what has been learned, and then never stop making it a priority. And I will reiterate that if someone has these goals tied to their personal employee goals every year, progress will be made. You know, another strategy that is becoming commonplace with many of the companies that I work with is tying ESG goals into executive compensation. And in many cases, these are DEI goals. You know, if bonuses are tied to moving the needle on DEI issues, then it becomes something that won't be ignored. But it should be noted that this is not something that can be done whimsically. Performance metrics should be realistic and should make sense. And what makes sense for one organization may not make sense for another organization. So organizations should be prepared to bring in consultants and experts to do studies on what metrics should be set for them, you know, especially when tying them into employees' annual goals. So basically, I think that, you know, if including DEI in program development is something that utilities and program administrators are serious about, then they will be intentional about it. And then if they're intentional, I think that progress would be made.
Here on, yes, all of that, and the tying it to incentives and budget. That is one of the things I always talk about when we're talking about internal at each one of our organizations. If you're serious about your DEI work, there is a budget line item for your DEI initiatives. Yeah, absolutely. But I love the tying it to bonuses.
Yeah.
Talk about getting that executive buy-in.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm gonna turn to some comments and questions in the chat here. Earlier on, there was a longer comment here from C. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But talking about, you know, some of the people that are being held responsible kind of to maybe improve housing stock, or even within the C&I space, some of these individuals are kind of in the middle and under-resourced, right? They're strapped for time, they're strapped for resources. We certainly find this in strategic energy management, that the energy managers, oftentimes they don't have time. They don't have a team. They're a team of one, right? So, you know, within that kind of context of that, and thinking about equity and inclusion, have you found any successful strategies for overcoming those barriers?
Oh, it's funny. When I read, and again, I don't know if it's C as their name, but when I read this comment, what jumped to my mind, and it was the absentee landlord issue that we have in our communities, where you have these individuals that own a wealth of properties that have terrible maintenance issues, and then, you know, as you were talking, Sada, it also made me think about in our rural communities, a lot of these industrial sites, their ownership is also further away. So the local leadership really isn't empowered as much to make upgrades or address issues in these ways. I think that, you know, the sharing of program resources is obviously something we work to do, and have field staff that engage with folks on real sort of a boots on the ground approach, walking literally into a facility and trying to find that low hanging fruit, get some easy early wins with those organizations, and demonstrate that it doesn't take much to take these types of energy saving opportunities. And then, you know, we've seen success with that grow, but it is really hard. And I would love to hear what the other panelists, if they have any recommendations that we can try and deploy here.
I will let Pamela go. She has comment because I didn't really catch the question, Sada.
I would just say, as far as you know, aren't we all overworked and under-resourced? I mean, under-resourced and overworked. Yeah, we all are. Like, it's tough for all of us to get all of this work. There's so much to be done. There is so much to be done. We're not all going to get it done in our entire workday. Not all of us here. It's going to take generations of us, at least another one or two. to get a lot of this work done, but we've got to start. We have to start somewhere. We have to, no matter how tired we are, how much work it is, it's got to start somewhere. And I go back to what Giselle said earlier, like I wanted to woohoo through the phone, like woohoo, yes, tie it into the pockets. When it hits pockets and it hits budgets and people aren't getting paid and money's not coming through, people pay attention. They'll get you resources. They'll bring people in to help you. You will find, you know, and this comes from corporate speak here, but you will find that dollars seem to find a way if it starts hitting the pockets of the organization. And so, you know, if it's important enough, which I think that it is, and I think that it's becoming more important, and organizations are realizing that, make the case study to get support for your work. Make the case study, make the pitch to your managers. Tell them why you need assistance getting this done. Tell them your ideas in getting this done. But keep pushing to get, if you truly believe in the work that you're doing and that it's going to make a difference long term, keep pushing for it, because if not you, then who?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and I think actually that segues to a good other topic that I wanted to make sure that we touch on before we wrap up our time here together. And that is, you know, both, I mean, I think all three of you have referenced this. This work has been going on for a while within the energy sector, right? The work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, it has been highlighted and kind of catapulted into a higher priority, which is a good thing. But my question, and this came from early discussions that we had, and this is primarily for Pamela, but I want Giselle and Caryn to have a chance to chime in as well. But, you know, there seems to be a lot of momentum and urgency right now around diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do we ensure that it persists, right? How do we make sure that we continue to bring people along, that we continue to push people to do better, to do the work, to follow through on their commitments? How do we do that? I mean, and make sure that we get the energy sector where we want it to be.
Intentionality. We have to be very intentional about the work that we're doing. Write it into your strategic plans. It's a part of your organizational growth. There's metrics behind it. There's accountability behind it. You have to be very because diversity is not intentional. You know, if it were intentional in this industry already, or if it was inherent, let's put it that way. If it were inherent, then I wouldn't have calls all the time asking me, where do I find minority employees? You know, because they don't have the network that show it. They don't have the network to connect them to it. Where do I find the minority-owned businesses? Because they're not aware of who they are, because they've used the same businesses time and time and time again. You know, be intentional. Put some kind of number, some kind of dollar, some kind of, you know, growth, like a growth process behind it. And then be able to account for that, to hold to it, put it in your annual report every year so your stakeholders can see it. Make it a business initiative. Diversity as a business initiative. It just has to be intentional until we don't have to make it intentional anymore, until it's just second nature. But let's make it intentional until that happens. I mean, it has to be intentional so much, in fact, that the current administration put intentionality behind it. The Justice 40 program, they said we have to ensure that these dollars are flowing into these communities, that we're giving people opportunity for work within these sectors, that we're ensuring that when this energy sector booms, that jobs are created for minority peoples, that, you know, minority communities are not left behind in the energy transition. They're being intentional about it. So shouldn't your organization be intentional about it if the government feels like they should have to be? So it's there, y'all. We just have to do it. Leadership has to get behind it and support it. It has to be a trickle down. If you're going to get managers and teams to buy into it, it has to come from leadership, and it has to be imperative. It has to happen now. You made the commitments and you made the statements already. Just, it has to happen now. It's imperative that it's happening now. So that's what I have to say, Sada.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
love that. Yeah. Giselle?
Yeah, and I would also say that, the power of stakeholder engagement is something that shouldn't be, underestimated. I think, identify who your key DEI stakeholders are, your employees, your shareholders, your customers, your supply chains, your contractors, identify them, and then make these key stakeholders part of the conversation from the very beginning. Understand their needs, understand their challenges, their priorities, their expectations, and then plan with these considerations in mind, with accountability both ways, to them and from them. And to me, those are some elements that will make the difference.
Can I add to that, Giselle, real quick? Because, and if you don't have those key stakeholders and connections and people that you can reach out to organizations like SIA or like other organizations that can help you make those connections. There are organizations and companies out here, that's what they do. They help you connect to those community partners and those stakeholders. So if you don't have the network, reach out to people that do have the network.
Amen.
Absolutely. I think that's one thing I always tell folks, like if your network looks like you, and then you need to diversify your network, right? And it has to be intentional and it takes time, right? It's not going to be a one-off. So if you have an open position, you're not going to fill that necessarily with a diversity candidate because you haven't done the work. You haven't laid the foundation. So you have to put in the time for that to become a reality. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here. I do want to highlight one question that came from Gail, though, and maybe we can dig in deeper in the breakout. So I invite folks to join us for the breakouts, and maybe we can get into this topic a little more. But Gail says, can any or all of you share some of your more creative partnerships or ideas to bring energy efficiency or weatherization programs to communities for whom there are more pressing issues like mental health and food insecurity? And I highlight this question because it's something that came up in our calls to prep for this panel. And that is, we know there are social determinants of health, right? This is often talked about in the health world and in public health. I think those same social determinants come into play with energy and energy burden, right? And there is an opportunity for us to collaborate across sectors to understand what the needs of of different communities are, right? And I think it goes back to something that each of you have said, and I want to highlight, and that is we have to center the people that we want to serve. We have to center them in our process for creating programs. We have to center them and make them part of the problem-solving solutions that we come up with. The way we're going to find our way to a more equitable energy system is by engaging those who we serve. And if we don't do that, then it will not be inclusive, it will not be equitable, it will not be diverse, right? So whether we're talking about residential programs or commercial or industrial, we really need to center those people that we want to serve.